we'll have about 10 minutes. We'll stop at 11:30 sharp so that we have about 10 minutes for a Q&A session with you. Over to you, John.
Thank you. One of the key things, I know I'm speaking to the people who are going to, in your own careers, change the world. And so it's critical that you become missionaries for the idea that not only is it necessary to think beyond the material in order to save the world and help each other, but it actually is much better as an approach. And once you think in terms of well-being, you immediately change what you think of about people's ability to look after each other. There are a lot of people who say to look at subjective well-being is just another version of looking at GDP. It's much more than that, because once you start looking at, and Aristotle was one of the first to really point this out, once you look seriously at what does lead people to think they have had a good life, whether they're asked in the middle, the beginning, or the end, it relates to a lot of things that are way beyond the material factors of life. Well, that has a great number of advantages. One of them, of course, is that most of the pressures on the environment are coming because people are busy trying to produce more goods and services all over the world and are measuring their own lives more in terms of what they have to use rather than their connections with other people. And it turns out that when you actually focus on what does make a good life, most of these things can be done in the most conditions of material absence. And of course, there are evidence from all over the world of people creating good communities for each other. We've looked at this, for example, in studies after natural disasters, after climate emergencies, and it turns out people feel better helping each other than they did in having more. And convince people, and it's you we need to convince. We can talk, and I will talk a bit about what it takes to convince today's current leaders to refocus their attentions. But really, this, like the attention to the climate itself, which has, after all, taken more than 50 years to move from worries about sustainable species to really requiring serious action on the part of everybody in their own lives and centrally. What we're coming along now and doing, and it's urgent, because if you don't convince people there is some way of having an umbrella measure that should be linking all these different parts of life, then they'll go off chasing their own particular goal, finding their own particular villain, and then ending up fighting more than solving problems. One of the key things that Lara did not mention, although it's close to her heart as it is to mine, is that one of the first things you learn when you look at well-being is the importance of other people and the other people in your lives, and that there is also something in psychology that's called, and it's in our hearts and our minds, unfortunately, a negativity bias. So you're inclined often, when you see a bad situation, to focus on the negative causes rather than the positive solutions, and it leads people to think worse of the people around them. Well, it makes a huge difference, as you could imagine, when you're dealing in an earthquake or a climate crisis, whether people rush in to help each other or, in fact, start competing for what little is left. The standard economic models have tended to say people are out for themselves, that they, in fact, want more for themselves, even if that means less for others. What we have learned, and what is critical to bring forward in our own minds and thinking about what to do next, is what in fact does drive people. And it turns out that it is very important for people to think positively and react positively. Well, that is a problem, and it's one of the key reasons why we have spent so long and put so much effort into making the world happiness more broadly available, and spending more time in talking to groups like yours and others about the traps you can get led into, even in the best of causes, without realizing what's happening. And a key one I'm going to spend a couple of minutes on now is, what right have you got to assume about how other people will respond? And that's critically important. It's been baked in, much like this fear of the unknown, the fear of the other, the tendency to trust people more who are like you than like others, that's baked into what's called system one thinking, that your immediate reaction to make you less likely to step on a snake. More fundamental to the long-run development of the human species has been an in-baked tendency for us to cooperate and work together to develop a better solution. Because in fact, at the community level, and over more than that, at the global level now, the capacity and the will to work together to solve common problems is absolutely essential. So what can we provide you from the well-being research that will convince you that the world is a better place already a better place in human terms than you thought it was? Well, the best example I can think of, and we have now managed to get these data in at least one round of the Gallup World Poll, is to ask people a question. If you dropped your wallet, how likely is it, do you think, that it would be returned? And then we specify, if found by a stranger, which is the most extreme case, or a police officer, or a neighbor, or somebody you meet in the local community. And so we know, because we have managed to get these questions in big national surveys, as in Canada, and in the Gallup World Poll for more than 150 countries, that people think that, although they think quite highly of their neighbors as likely to return their lost wallet. And the return of the lost wallet is a very important test, because it tests not just honesty. You could be perfectly honest and you see something of value on the ground, and you're not stealing and you're not doing anything with it, but you're busy, so you go off and do your things. But to interrupt your life and go and say that wallet on the ground reflects something important for other people, and if I want to help other people, I'll pick up that wallet and try and get it back to them. So it's not just being honest, it's much more than that. It's being generous enough, empathetic enough to reach out and help other people. And probably because of what you hear about other people, and indeed what you see on the news, people tend to think that their neighbors might return their wallet, but they're not very optimistic in most countries of whether strangers will return their wallets. We did a big research because the question was in the Canadian General Survey, we managed to get it so that they were answering
John,
all
sorry.
4 questions.
Sorry to interrupt. Just wanted to let you know that we have 5 minutes until the Q&A
Absolutely,
session.
and it is a real danger for me that especially when I get into the positivity part of this and the trust side, but it's going to be the most important thing I can leave you with. Lara has taken you through all 6 factors. What I'm telling you now is that these presence of the positives are what are going to drive the world. Okay, bottom line on the wallet story is that we found the average likelihood that people thought the wallet would be returned if dropped was 25%. And then 20 wallets were experimentally dropped in precisely that same big bustling city, and 80% of them were returned. Well, that's telling you that people are a lot more trustworthy and a lot more benevolent than you thought you were. A similar experiment has been now done in more than 50 countries all over the world. And the same thing is true. People are actually much more inclined to help others than you think they are by a factor of 2. As Lara has already told you, when you think you're operating in a world where everybody is out to help each other, or not everybody, we know, but many more people than you think, then it'll be much easier to create solutions to common property resources. And of course, a sustainable physical environment is the ultimate in common property resources. I'm going to quite soon ask for questions so I can lead back to your interests when I carry on. If you don't ask questions, I'll just continue, but it's much better if we use you to direct the conversation, because the whole purpose of the World Happiness Report is to get these conversations about the real deep aspects of life into the forefront. We use the country rankings because that's what draws people in to look at the report in the first instance. But that's not the important thing. The important thing is, what is it that produces a better life? And how will those things we learn about the sources of a better life help us to produce sustainable development? Our objective over the next 10 years is to take life satisfaction, these Aristotelian measures of a good life, and to move them from the one appearance among the Sustainable Development Goals, but an umbrella over the whole set of Sustainable Development Goals, so that in fact we weight alternative things to focus in terms of what they will do to produce better lives, and harness people's willingness to help each other in order to make it happen. Over to you.
Thank you so much, John. And before we open the floor for questions, I just wanted to let everyone know that John is one of the founding editors of the World Happiness Report. And so it's an absolute honor to have him join us today. And we only have 10 more minutes with him. So if you have any questions, please feel free to unmute yourself and ask away.
Don't be shy. You must have something that says, wait a minute, if this medicine is really that good, why isn't everyone already taking it? And there are many answers to that as well. But I'd love to hear what it is in your minds that stops you thinking, or maybe you're all convinced. If you're all convinced, then we can start talking about what the next stages in order to make this happen.
Go ahead, Sana.
Go ahead, Sana.
I think one part of the report I found like really interesting was how like shared conflict actually leads to like more generosity within the community, I guess from my understanding. And I was wondering if you could expand on the psychology behind that and sort of, yeah, elaborate on, I guess, that relationship.
Well, there's a whole, as many of you know, there's a whole element in psychology called, and it's still, as it were, operating on the fringes rather than in the center of social psychology, called positive psychology. And it was found, and 90%, 95% of the writings in social psychology were about the understanding and treatment of depression, of mental states, negative mental states. And some very important psychologists, including especially Ed Diener, with whom I have worked, who was a founder of positive psychology, have said that's not right, because to understand the processes whereby positive things come into pass is equally important. And that has also led to evolutionary psychology, where people have said, if it is the case that in fact people do feel better, and there's much experimental evidence on this, when doing things for other, and people don't walk by a bad thing, they rush in and help. When there's an earthquake, much more than you would read about, people rush out to help each other, and saying that from the perspective of group survival, if you think in a Darwinian way, the groups that do cooperate with each other are going to survive. At the global level now, it's our ability to work together that will allow us to survive. And so the scale at which we have to survive and cooperate to survive has gone up from the family to the tribe to the nation and now to the world. And so to understand the importance of that, and I can carry on for hours with the evidence supporting that, it's critically important that we harness it. And to harness it properly, you have to be convinced that it's real. And you don't want to go off assuming good things when they're not true. But the point is, people think worse of other people than they should. And they themselves get more pleasure out of doing things for others, and so do others. And doing that, understanding that makes you, and there's also lots of evidence on this, makes you more likely to reach out and help others and to cooperate, whether we're sharing water or food or other aspects of the environment.
Thank you, John. We have 2 more questions. Ambi, go ahead.
Yeah, coming back to your point, what do you really think like motivates people to, I guess, underestimate how good or like trustworthy their community really is?
I've already spoken. It's a very good question, as the other one was as well. There is what's called an innate negativity bias, and some people have argued that's from earlier evolution, where you needed to respond quickly to something negative in order to not be bitten by the snake, as it were. But that is now buttressed in modern life, because that same negativity bias, the appeal, the perceived appeal that people are more interested in hearing bad things than good things, means there's a huge distortion in the news feed. So you learn much more in the news, and this is online news as well as mainstream news. You learn much more about a world in which seems to be populated by people doing bad things to each other than people doing good things for each other. So why was it such a surprise when I told you those wallet data? It's because you never hear them. And you may hear it for your own wallet and think you're just lucky. You don't hear the broader evidence. So I think what we hear about each other, and I speak often to both government groups and media groups about the responsibility to give a balanced education about the world to people. So it's important for me to convince the news providers that, in fact, the world is a better place than the world they're depicting in their headlines and stories. And it's their responsibility to, and this is true of teachers, as of course, and government leaders, as is to the people writing and filming in the media, to show people the way the world really is. Because if in the absence of being given a broader, more balanced picture, they'll end up believing that the world is bad, as the headlines and the stories suggest that it is. So it's a combination of an out-of-date, leftover fear of others to harness. The important thing now is to really build on this more central positive aspect. And the first thing we need to do is to change the way in which we describe the world to each other, not just pretending it's much better than it is, but showing them that it is much less bad than they think it is.
Thank you, John. Laura, go ahead.
Yeah, so I think that, well, I kind of disagree with your point because, for example, I think that, well, I live in Mexico, and here we have 11 women disappear each day in because they're like robbed. So I think that negative bias, especially for women, can be actually a method of survival because you don't know who is out there to get you because like there's a lot of organized crime. So I do think that although we should get rid of the negative bias, I think that it's a very utopical way. So I guess my question would be, how can we build community trust and, well, yeah, and get rid of our negative bias when we live in insecure societies where our lives are being threatened.
Life will always have risks, and you're quite right. And it's a super important point to make, because it is the fundamental point that people make when they react to what our evidence seems to suggest and say that's just a Pollyanna-ish view of the world. The world is a tough, nasty place out there. Unless we accept it as tough and nasty and respond defensively, we won't survive until tomorrow. The answer to that is to, as it were, take the golden rule seriously, but not too seriously, because you're saying surely it doesn't make sense to go and stand in front of a bus that's coming at you at a high speed, is saying, oh, the driver will stop. You want to give the driver a chance to stop. You want to keep yourself safe in case that driver was looking the other way, or indeed was that one person out of many who'd be just as happy hitting you as not. And so you have to respond to the dangers in the situation that you're in. But in order to improve that situation, you have to believe in the possibility, the probability, and the likelihood that there are better well springs than you think you are. That's the importance of those wallet data. And you have to start, because otherwise, and this is a really big deal in the world today, there's a risk aversion effect that comes in. So dangers in schools, demonstrated by school shootings here and there, for example, then you say, oh, well, then we're going to lock up the doors. Elder care, we lock them in the elder care facilities for their safety, we say, but we're closing doors to the kinds of human contacts that build a better world. So you have to have enough courage to say to those who are keeping us isolated from others, thinking that will keep us safe, to say we are not going to be safe unless we open the doors to each other's hearts and minds and make those human connections that will allow us to work together. So you have to convince people with the evidence, and sometimes you have to start small. In many murder-riven communities, for example, they have gone in to the local community centers and help the people by essentially saying, let's together work on the murder rate and the crime rate in this community. What is required to improve it? And they find almost universally and very quickly that to collectively sit down and build connections with each other, and it involves building connections with people who otherwise would have shot each other happily. But you have to get that communication before you can get the cooperation. So it means doing it on a demonstration basis in the first, among those with much courage in the first, and then you need information to let the fact that these experiments tend to work become public knowledge. So they're part of what everyone believes, is that, in fact, we've been assuming these people are really awful because they pray to the wrong person or they do the wrong sort of thing. He said, no, wait a minute. There's a deeper underlying humanity which we all share, and we have to learn more about the other before we will understand and work better with them. And that there are fewer dangers by opening doors to that connection. There are saved by simply keeping people isolated and thinking the worst of each other.
John, do you have time for one more question?
Very short. Your questions are shorter than my answers. I'll try. Give you a very fast one, and then I'll go.
Go ahead, Bernice.
Yeah, I just want to say that you're super interesting and you're an interesting speaker. And I was like super attached when you were talking about your points. So I'm not sure if this was answered in the beginning since I was a bit late, but can you shortly explain like how the factors considered in the World Happiness Report align or with contribute to the specific sustainable development goals?
Yes, well, the number, they all do. But you get the sustainable development goals through cooperation. That's essentially required. And as Lara explained, to build on these human connections takes no material resources. So it's much more efficient in environmental terms to concentrate on time spent speaking with each other, meeting with each other, enjoying with each other, walking in the woods with each other, rather than acquiring more goods and services. So you immediately, as soon as you start realizing that and saying, I'm not going to look for something more material by way of income, I am going to spend more time and with my family and friends and working together in my community to solve the problems. You solve the problems better. You clean up your local rivers. You make the local community a place where a stranger is a friend you haven't met yet, rather than a danger to be avoided. So by opening these doors, you get the climate for solution at the micro level to all these sustainable development goals, as well as reducing the overall pressure. And the ability of, that's why we use well-being as the top goal, is because when you're thinking about different sustainable development goals to attack and how to attack them, it should be in the context of improving broader well-being. So not only does it refocus what you're trying to do, it gives you many more tools to use. Another way of putting it is social norms, i.e. how we behave with each other, are much more important than taxes or regulations and rules in changing the way in which people do things. And that's true whether they're sitting in executive suites, on the work floor, on the streets, or in the communities. And now I'm afraid I'm going to have to go. I've much enjoyed my time with you. Thank you very much.